In this video, I'll be talking about the theme of loneliness in the novella of Mice and Men, written by John Steinbeck. I've created this video with a specific exam in mind, which is the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam. But I'm sure this would be relevant for many students out there that are studying this text for a different course, because we go into great detail. We do talk a lot about context because of the exam I previously mentioned. Half the marks are awarded to contextual knowledge, so keep that in mind. But let's get started. So I think if you get an exam question on loneliness, a great place to start is to think about where it is set. So we immediately hear about this place, Soledad, which is Spanish for loneliness. So immediately we just have this setting that is established, that is clearly linked to the theme of loneliness. And the first time we see George and Lenny, they are described as walking in single file down the path, and even in the open, one stayed behind the other. That's interesting. Imagine that, right? Walking, I don't know, in an open field, and you and your friend are still walking, one in front of the other. So the fact that they don't walk side by side, even in the open, might symbolize the solitary life that they lead. They're not physically alone, but they are lonely. I don't know if you've heard that saying, lonely together. And I think that is what Steinbeck was trying to highlight through George and Lenny's friendship, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. Their friendship does create a contrast to the other workers who are all alone, but they are still lonely, right? They don't really offer meaningful companionship to one another. They don't really understand each other. So they are both very lonely still. So linking this to context, everything in blue is context. By setting the novella in a real place, Steinbeck gives the story some authenticity. So while the characters are fictional, their stories represent the reality of many in the 1930s. And then we have that powerful image of the two men walking in single file, which you could argue really represents the lonely life of the itinerant worker in the 1930s, who, due to a scarcity of jobs because of the high unemployment rates at that time, had to tackle life alone to be able to survive, right? You needed to be able to get up and go anywhere where there was work. And that meant, you couldn't establish long-term friendships, meaningful relationships, and you wouldn't be around your family if you had any. So let's look at George. As I've said already, there is this contrast with George and Lenny having a friendship, and everyone's quite suspicious of it, right? If you remember, the boss is suspicious of George. What's going on here, right? Because he doesn't see friendship amongst the itinerant workers. He sees lonely men. So, of course, they have this refrain that is repeated throughout the novella. I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you. So that's been memorized by Lenny, which reveals the interdependency of George and Lenny's relationship. And it does create that contrast of loneliness. But like I said before, you could argue they are lonely together. And you could support that with the repeated mention of George playing solitaire. If you're not aware, solitaire is a card game that you play on your own. And that could symbolize the loneliness of George, because Lenny, since he is childlike, he can't really offer true companionship to a grown man like George. He's really someone to look after. He's not really someone on the same wavelength, if you like, as George. So the card game might also foreshadow the solitary life ahead of George, because, hate to spoil it, but hopefully everyone's read the novella by now. George will kill Lenny at the end of the novella and lead a life of loneliness. Or at least anticipate that. So linking that to context, the high demand for work amongst migrant workers created a competitive and hostile environment. Rather than their hardships being a united factor, bringing them together, it actually set the working man against each one another in the name of self-interest. So, of course, we also have that transient lifestyle that we already talked about, meaning that it was impossible to settle down, have meaningful friendships, or um, start a family. The other character I would zoom in on is Crooks. Crooks, I would argue, is lonely to a whole other degree, right? Because he's othered, right? He's treated as something different to the others, and likewise, you could say Curly's wife as well, because she's a woman. But we don't really see much of him outside of chapter 4. So even that in itself, you could say, Crooks isn't that present in the novella other than chapter 4. And that in itself is an indication of his marginalization. If you did want to think about quotations to support that, you could think about where he sleeps, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. So even the setting of his bedroom represents the way he is isolated from everyone else, right? Because he is black, he's not allowed to be in the bunkhouse. He has to be physically separated from them. And eventually he does open up to Lenny and say, I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. So that's him really, highlighting the painful impact of his loneliness, right? That it almost becomes a physical illness. He's that lonely. And that, of course, draws great empathy from the reader. The Jim Crow laws, linking this to the context, right? Why is he so lonely? Well, because America in this time was incredibly racist. And you can support that with the Jim Crow laws, which were a number of laws in America that were enforced between 1876 and 1965. And that offered a legal basis for segregating and discriminating against African Americans. In other words, the way that they use the law to justify discrimination by saying, well, everyone is equal, we're not the same, and therefore we should be kept separate. So, that justified black people having separate educational institutions, as an example, okay, living in different neighborhoods, going to different restaurants, and so on. So being the only black person on this ranch means that Crooks has nobody to see as a friend, or again, someone to talk to and to establish a meaningful relationship with. Curly's wife, being the only woman on the ranch in some respects, has a similar experience in the sense that she is also unable to establish meaningful relationships with others. We see this symbolized by the way that she is positioned. She's never in the room with the men, right? She stood still at the doorway. She's looking in. She's never really steps in. So Curly's wife's position physically represents her marginalization. The ranch is a man's world where she is not welcome. Look at how she repeatedly says, I'm looking for Curly. I think what we realize, at least by the end of the novella, if not earlier, is that that's really just an excuse to interact with the workers. It is interpreted by the men as flirtatious, and it could very well just be that she wants to talk to someone. And I think by the end of the novella, when she opens up to Lenny and says, I get awful lonely, I think we start to realize and understand her behavior, that maybe she's not trying to flirt, maybe she's just desperate for attention, and she'll get it any way she can. She certainly makes excuses by saying she's looking for Curly. I don't think she's looking for Curly. She doesn't like him. She tells Lenny that at the end of the novella. But it does also reveal that she's neglected by her husband. We never see the couple together. So that's a lonely relationship again. Lonely together, right? They're married. They're supposed to be together, but they're not really. Linking this to context, the perceived inferiority of women was apparent in the fact that they were paid half what men were paid for the same job. So she lives in a very sexist society in 1930s America. And also due to high unemployment, it was frowned upon for married women to work. They were seen as a threat, really, to jobs, to men who were seeking work. So they were encouraged to not take work. And there was a real mindset of, the workplace is a place for men. The home is a place for a married woman to be domesticated look after the home and so on. And so she's really not welcome on the ranch by the men. And of course, that adds to her loneliness. And then just thinking in general, and this comes from Slim, who is presented as the most intuitive out of everyone. So we as readers, I think, are encouraged to really trust his interpretation of what he sees. And he says to George, when he was talking about George and Lenny's friendship, he says, ain't many guys that travel around together. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. As that's really perceptive. He's seen, he's one of the few men on the ranch that will be a permanent worker because he's highly skilled and the boss will want to keep hold of him, and I'm sure he'll be paid a lot more than the other workers. So he will have seen men come and go. And so, he's just sharing his observations with George at this point. But what he's really showing here is a deeper understanding of the loneliness, that he believes that loneliness stems from fear. How could we explain that fear? Well, we can link that to context. Look at what's in blue, okay? There's many reasons why people felt isolated in the 1930s and felt fearful. The migratory nature, which we've already talked about, due to the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, kept men on the move. They're fighting for each other's jobs. There's no time to make friends. Due to high unemployment, women aren't welcome in the workplace. So there's a fear almost of women, right? They're a threat because they're cheaper than men. The Jim Crow laws legalize segregation between whites and blacks. So we've got this fear of black people, and that keeps people separated. That keeps them everybody lonely. No one is coming together, right? And then we have capitalism. And this is at least from Steinbeck's perspective, because he was an anti-capitalist. He saw that as a system that caused rifts between fellow human beings due to its competitive nature. And so through all of this, and maybe through the eyes of Slim, Steinbeck is trying to say maybe we should be advocating for a different way to be, right? Maybe we shouldn't be sexist. Maybe we shouldn't be racist. Maybe we shouldn't be capitalists, because it's creating these rifts between fellow human beings, and we're leading a life in isolation, and we're not supposed to. We're supposed to be social beings as human beings. So I think maybe this would be a point that you raise right at the end of your essay, because I think it gives a nice overview of what I think Steinbeck was trying to argue through his novella. So of course, at the end of your essay, you want to have that overall message, and I think there's kind of three main things. One, I think through this novella, he was trying to highlight how the capitalist system creates rifts between people. He also wanted to shine a light on the cruel treatment of those marginalized in society and create compassion and think about a different way that we can treat each other. And then just overall, I think his main argument, at least this is what I took from reading the novella, is that humans are social beings and they need friendship. But to have friendship, we have to be kind to each other. We have to trust each other, and we have to lose our fear of one another. I'm always interested to hear your own thoughts. I love it when people give their comments below. So please feel free to share your comments. And you're always more than welcome to reach out to me if you have any further questions. Mrs. Rumsey at mrsrumsey.com.